Okay, welcome to Regenerative Solutions for Pasture Problems. This webinar has been sponsored by the Adelaide and Mount Lofty Ranges Natural Resources Management Board. And I'll let Mariette introduce herself. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Julie, and also welcome to all guests that are joining us tonight. A brief introduction. I'm founder of MB Equine Services, which is a consultancy that is specialized in the education and of course consultation for equine nutrition, property design, and pasture management. And in this webinar, we'll spend some time on looking at these regenerative solutions, how we can improve our soils and pastures. Besides being involved with my own business, I'm also a specialized lecturer at the University of New England here in Armidale. And I'm also currently doing a PhD in particular foraging behavior and diet selection. And this really kind of coincides with my interest in improving practical solutions for horse owners and the industry in how we can better manage horses in pastoral systems. So hopefully, again, in this webinar, I hope to combine again some parts of my research into practical solutions for horse owners. And at the end of the presentation, I will also provide a little bit more information about the business and how you can stay up to date, because I publish quite a lot of articles or links to workshops or like these invitations, like webinars. Throughout the webinar, you can ask questions, so you have a digital hand. So don't be afraid to stop the presentation and ask the question. Julie will organize that. And also, if there are any problems with the sound, please let us know. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, I think that most horse owners are quite familiar with certain pasture problems, so I want to spend a little bit of time on which common problems we can encounter. And to be able to kind of get into the solution part, we need to have a better understanding of the actual problem. So how is the problem caused and how can we improve it? And so we need to go a little bit into depth into how ecosystems work or ecosystem processes. And then that will lead us into which tools we can use to manage these ecosystems. And that will progress to, of course, soil development, or how to improve soil health, because most pasture problems are always related to the soil. And it's very important that we hydrate our soils. Either we have two problems: we either have too much water or we don't have enough water. And to build soil, we really need to look at water. Without water, there is no life. And then at the end, I want to give a couple of notes on pasture planning, but that is on its own already a webinar. So I just want to kind of highlight some main points, and hopefully that will lead maybe to a future webinar, or for yourself to do some more investigation into how to better plan and how to look at, for instance, pasture management strategies such as rotational grazing and advanced grazing, cell grazing. At the end, we'll have a little opportunity again to ask some questions. But as I said, throughout the presentation, you're more than welcome to ask or even give comments, of course. So let's start. I think that one of my first questions I always ask is, how do you vision the pasture of horses? How do you vision how horses should live? And I think this is a very nice picture, and I think most people get quite happy or quite quiet when they see this picture. I think that most are very well aware that horses are adapted to a high fiber diet. They eat a variety of plant species, and you can see that very nicely here. I don't really want to repeat that, but what I want you to look at is the behavior of the horse in this picture. As you can see, all the horses are with their heads down, and you can see, even though it's a still picture, you can see horses making small steps or making movements. They walk a couple of steps, even while they're keeping their head down, and then go to the next patch where they hope to find some very palatable plants. What you also can see is that some of the plants you can see there are quite coarse, so you see quite high fibrous plants together with a mix of kind of herbaceous plants. And this is, I think, what most people would consider a natural system, or where you see free roaming horses or wild horses, grazing. But if we now change this picture to the domesticated horse in the modern world, then we generally have been keeping them in a similar way as what we see with livestock, so livestock production. So as you can see, I've here made a nice comparison with cattle. And of course, they have similarities. They're both what we call large ungulate herbivores. They both have a similar way of how to digest plants or ferment plants. One has a rumen and the other one has a hindgut. But what we see is that they both have there are some differences in how they can cope with certain types of plants. So here you can see in the bottom a nice picture of how we keep horses, particularly these are broodmares, on improved pasture. And depending on the type of horse, some will do really well with improved systems like that we raise livestock in, and other horses will have troubles. So we'll see horses with metabolic and digestive disorders, such as colic and laminitis, and you may have experienced this firsthand, or of people in your surrounding. I think that everybody is quite aware that we keep horses in this way. But let's have a bit of a closer look at the differences in physiology between ruminants and horses, and why horses not always would fit in this livestock production system. So here's a comparison. If we look at the top picture of the cow and the horse, we see that horses on what we call young short herbage, that is low in fiber and relatively high in protein, that horses can still do very well. Like they can cope quite well in a high productive or in a improved pasture system. But they are not as efficient in digesting that fiber as what we see in cattle, because they have the ability to chew the cud, and then they can regurgitate, chew the cud, and so they can, with the help of microbes in their rumen, they can extract much more nutrients out of that than horses, because with horses it has to go first to the stomach before it ends up in the hindgut. So we see a little bit of differences in the efficiency of fiber digestion. But still, horses can do quite well in livestock production systems, and that's why we have been keep doing what we've been doing and keeping them in the same system. But if we actually look at where horses are adapted to, or what they really what their strategy is compared to ruminants, is that they're actually adapted to eat on a continuous basis, and that they can actually sustain themselves quite well on an all dense herbage, so that is high in fiber and relatively low in protein. So if you look back or think back at that picture, the first picture that I showed, you saw that kind of short herbage with kind of that stalky, longer grass. And actually horses can do really well on that. Although they may not be as efficient in the fiber digestion part, but they will increase their intake. And so these two types of animals have then been able to coexist. So the horse didn't survive the extinction process by adapting himself or the self physiologically to a different niche within the same habitat. And this is kind of basic, optimal foraging or foraging theory. And it's important to understand because it will help us with designing pastures and moving toward pastures that are better designed for horses. But it doesn't say that we cannot have both systems. We really would like to see that combination of fiber, high fiber, and quality forage. And that brings us actually to get a better understanding of what the main objectives are to manage grasses for horses. So we want to, in most situations, we would like to have quality grasses, and particularly if we're dealing with broodmares or young stock, we would like to keep them or maintain them primarily on pasture. But for those that are dealing with a very different type of horse, more the leisure horse or the pony or the Spanish horse or a good doer, draft horses, we may want to avoid actually these high quality grasses that are particularly high in non-structural carbohydrates. They can lead to these disorders, but also what we see is that horses will start ineffectively use the pasture, so you will get this patch look in your pasture. So you may be quite familiar with that. In an ideal situation, if we have the space, we'd also like to grow adequate grasses for conserved forages, and we want to maintain grass cover for kind of cushioning for horses to exercise on, particularly if we're dealing with young horses. But also we want to have grass cover not only for the animal, it's also to keep a lot of good stuff in the soil. Ground cover is very important. And this brings us actually to why is it important to have a healthy and an active soil where we can keep horses on. So the importance of regenerating horse pastures. And I think that when you see the list that I provided here on this slide, that you're probably quite familiar with, okay, there are good reasons. Of course, for the health of the horse. The horse is adapted to a habitat where it can roam, where it can forage on a continuous basis, high fiber foods. So pasture is the ideal setting. Of course, in certain situations, if you're competing with your horse or if you don't have enough pasture, you may have to house your horse, so there's nothing wrong about that. But if you can have horses in a pastoral system, you are already ticking a big box on the welfare. Then, of course, the conservation of the land and the environment, you're also a custodian of the land when you become a property owner. And if you own a property, you want to keep it neat because you may want to sell it. So the aesthetics is also a big point, particularly also if you are running an adjustment. And then, of course, if you have pasture and you have enough biomass, you can reduce the input of conserved forages. Of course, we not get all away with that, particularly if we're dealing with certain environmental peaks such as drought or flooding. But over the year, it will help you with reducing those feed costs and general feed costs. And of course, we would like to keep the fat away. So having horses outside will help with, that they're always moving. They will be able to forage, and that's the biggest occupation in the day. So if we stimulate that, we generally will reduce some of these problems like colic. That is actually one of the biggest ones that horse owners will deal with if they don't provide enough roughage to the horse. And on top of that, we see some behavioral issues as well. And I think I've discussed this in another webinar. In one of the first one, we talked a little bit more about confinement and nutritional problems and behavioral problems. So I hope I convince you that it's a good thing if you have pasture and that it's taking action to keep it, either to improve it, so if you have problems, or to maintain. Are there any questions so far? Because I have a technical issue.
No, we don't have any questions at the moment. So as people are logging into the webinar, you may or may not have a question box. Depends if you're logging in on your smartphone or your iPad. If you have a desktop computer or a laptop, you will have a question box and you will have a chat box. Okay. So feel free to use those and I can start to work on some of the questions that come in. Thank you.
Okay, well, technical problem solved. So I hope I convinced you about the importance of taking care of our land. And let's now go into, well, most of us will be dealing to some degree with pasture problems. I have not encountered one property that has nothing, that is just perfect, like textbook perfect, picture perfect, probably like this one. So let's have a look and a closer look at that. So here again, an impression of an average horse property that I may encounter, you may own yourself. This is a medium-sized property, still a commercial, semi-commercial facility. And if we look at this from a bird view, you can see that it's very easy to read the landscape and then pick up on some of the pasture problems. Of course, we can zoom into that, but just from a global view, I have just put a couple of arrows in. So, of course, we can see quickly that there is some erosion, particularly in the corners, and I think that most horse owners will say, yeah, I have this as well. And these are the areas where, of course, horses are either waiting for food or they may be pacing, or because they may be separated from other horses. We can see in the gullies, so in the far left of the picture here, we can see some erosion in near the creek area, so where the property may go, well, where there may be a bit of a drop in the property. So a bit of erosion where not necessarily you see directly horses, but could also be just a runoff. So either horses or just a runoff from water that can cause that. So just from a bird view, we can really quickly pick up on certain things. And from this angle, it may not look that bad, but if we zoom into that, we can see some more issues. So let's have a look at a list of them, and I think that most will be familiar with them and can put their hand up, digital hand in this case, which problems they may encounter. So particular overgrazing, compacted soils, you can see here a horse in a muddy situation, erosion, over-resting oxidation. This may be something that you're not really familiar with, but pastures that are over-rested too long can oxidize, especially if there is no grass cover on it or vegetation on it. Salinity, depending in certain areas in Australia, it's more obvious or more of a problem than in other areas. Waterlogging also, particular in the wetter parts of the country. Weeds, I think that most can put their hands up for weeds. And then all of these problems, or actually it's generally like a domino effect, can cause what we call horse-sick pastures. And I want to highlight that with the next picture. I enlarged it to get a better view of what a horse-sick pasture looks like. So again, I want you to look, well, from a bird view you can see quite quickly certain issues. But first of all, let's look at the horse behavior. Here we see that the horses, or if you look at the horses, there are four in this picture, they're all kind of on this small island where there is still a little bit of green pig. But particularly the horse where I have this red arrow is trying to get even outside that and is putting his head through the fence, through barbed wire to get to a clean, fresh path on the other side. So you can definitely see that there are some other issues. For instance, weeds. And they're particularly in this little island where the horses are probably intensively grazing. Very obvious, there's not a lot, there's manure built up and there's not a lot to eat for the horse. So there is definitely a clear overgrazing problem. But if we can see the buildup of manure can cause another problem, particularly if it's not cleaned. And if you just look through that kind of brown patch, you can see that the manure is just kind of harrowed, and it's not cleaned up by the horse owner. And so what we get is that we can get a cycle of reinfection of parasites. So if the horses are infected with parasites, they can reinfect themselves and the others because there is no clean grass. So they will always have some grass or some plant where there may be some parasites. So, and if the horses are then wormed, either wormed on a set basis, which is the general practice is like 6 or 8 weeks, then what we can also get is a buildup of a resistancy problem. But just looking at this paddock and the way that these are all ponies, one horse, how these are kept, I guess if there was any worming happening, I think these horses were kind of really left to their own, and not a lot of management is happening. I mean, I'm showing you a very extreme or kind of an extreme situation, but we don't want to get into this horse sick situation. So this is put everything together of that list.
Hi Mariette, we have a question.
Yeah.
If you spread the manure around, how long do you need to rest the paddock for the manure to break down enough for them to come back onto that pasture?
That's a really good question, and that is kind of the problem with one of these practices of harrowing. This really depends on how active your soil is. So if you have an active soil and you have a healthy soil, then the manure will be broken down quite quickly because there is moisture and there are soil workers. I'm not only talking about dung beaters, I'm talking about many workers. There's not one particular soil worker that is doing all the work. It's a combination of breakdown of organic matter and the soil workers taking their part in that process. And so what we see is that if that is in an effective soil, there is water, there are soil microbes, that may be quite quick. Within probably a week or 5 days, you can see that all the manure is taken and is broken down, and it just becomes almost similar to the soil. Yeah? But if we are in a situation like here where the soil is not active, or we are in a very arid system, and I think that if you are from around South Australia, you probably are very familiar with it, you can see this laying around for a long time. It's not broken down. You can see it is scattered, but it stays still in clumps, and there's no soil workers or no degradation happening. So it really depends on in what climate you are and what kind of condition your soil is. So that also means that if you want to do this practice, which is not a bad practice, depending on, on the condition, then you really want to have an active soil before you do this harrowing. If not, then in situations where you are building the soil, my advice is to take off the manure and then make it into a compost first to make healthy soil, and then think about harrowing in a later stage. And then when you can harrow it and have an active breakdown. So if we look at, for instance, the frequency of, if we look at the problems that Australian horse owners may encounter, I want to highlight here some results of a survey that I've done, where I looked at the browsing behavior of horses at pasture, but I was also interested in their pasture condition. And so I asked respondents to provide me with if they were encountering any pasture and land problems, and they could select any that apply to the management of their, apply to their property, and give me. And what I did is I combined that into looking at one problem and then a combination. So that's on the main diagonal, which is the bold letters. We find the total count. So here we see that weeds had the total count, so almost 80% of the respondents. The respondents were a little bit over 400. 80% of these respondents were having weeds as one of their problems. Then the next one is overgrazing. So say 50, half of the horse owners said yes to that. And then the third one was compaction. We then look at the combination, which is the off diagonal, which is the regular letters. We see that overgrazing plus weeds gives the highest combination count. Of course, that is not surprising, knowing that weeds and then overgrazing in that order were the highest, had the highest count. So a combination of weeds and overgrazing. And I want you to just memorize this, because we're going to come back to this later. What I want to do first is get into our ecosystem processes. So if we want to solve this problem, if we want to improve our pastures, we need to understand better our problem, and we can only do that if we even zoom in that more, and we need to understand then the ecosystem processes. Okay, first something more general, the bigger picture. When you're dealing with natural systems, and if you pay attention and you observe, you will find that nature has a lot of patterns, and these are very beautiful, but these patterns are very important as a tool to read the landscape. For instance, there are the way the water runs is always from the highest to the lowest. That's a pattern, unless you have observed that the water goes up from naturally. Because only when we build systems, yes, we can feed by pipes and pumps, we can feed the water up, but nature, gravity, always dictates that water will go down. And so erosion patterns, or where water runs, is a very important pattern to understand. Of course, trees, where trees grow, and which direction they grow. Think about where the sun is and how the wind may affect them. Those are patterns. You can see it even in the soil, like in the desert. You can see which way the wind comes from. Of course, we have very important patterns as well in plants, and also the behavior, which is pretty much what my passion is about, is looking at grazing behavior and foraging behavior and understanding that better to make better, practical advice for horse owners like yourself. So these are all patterns, and I really want you to invite you to pay a closer attention to it, because in the small details you may find the solution to your problem. And then, coming back to reading the landscape, it's a very useful skill because it will help you within your property to either design your whole property if you're in the process of redesigning or you're buying a new piece of land. Having this skill will already dictate if you want to buy the property, which parts you want to improve, which parts are at risk. It helps indeed with, as I said, the prediction of water flow, placing trees, finding pockets of water, knowing where your good soil is. So where water is generally also where you find the better parts of your pasture. Prediction of soil, and as I said, looking at where the wind comes from and the sun comes from, and in cases where you are also living in an area where frost can happen, can help you with managing your property better. And I think this is the crucial part that we are missing. We're trying to quickly find solutions. Preferably, we like quick solutions that we can buy off the shelf, like a bag of feed. But when we're dealing with natural systems, that's not always possible. We really need to be an active player in the process by first, most important, observing. And then, of course, some knowledge, some education about, well, okay, I've seen these things, but how can I then improve them? Well, let's take this a bit practical. Let's actually think about reading the landscape. And generally what we then see is that there is always a symptom most of the times. But we're not always understanding what the underlying problem is. So getting back to some of the common problems on your horse property, and we know this list, and probably you have one of these or more. I want to invite you now to think about a couple of scenarios and try to engage with this to find the underlying problem. So let's go to the first one. So the symptom being weed. So look at this picture and you can see pistils and you see patches. So you see some small herbage, some prickle.
Hi, Mariette. Perhaps the participants can use the question box, and you can type either in the chat box or the question box in response to the answers that or the questions that Mariette's asking you. And also, Mariette, we've got two more questions perhaps after this section.
Yeah, for sure. So the symptom is being weeds on this property. But what is the underlying problem?
Okay, we've got a couple of answers here. Both of them are overgrazing.
Overgrazing.
Oh, another overgrazing.
Overgrazing. Anybody thinks anything different than overgrazing?
Got one that's poor soil.
Poor soil, yes. Well, we think in the right way. Soil.
Any other suggestions?
So we have overgrazing or poor soil.
Yes.
Well, we're very close.
Oh, compaction. Not one that has...
Yes, that's the right word. The problem is being compaction. We'll get to this. If you don't understand this part where you kind of get, you're like, but I think it's overgrazing. Let's go further. So the symptom being waterlogging, what is the underlying problem? And think about patterns in this way.
Okay, we've got another answer of compaction for this one.
Indeed, indeed. I'm not going to drag it out, but indeed, compaction. So let's go to the next one. Symptom is being erosion. What would be the underlying problem?
Okay, we've got someone else answering compaction again, and drainage can be a problem too.
Yeah, for sure. So it's indeed compaction. And the last one, symptom being can't get grass to grow. And the underlying problem, I think that everybody is quite aware that we have
compaction.
A certain pattern now. Compaction, yes. Okay. So any of these that you can see on your property by observing, that are all symptoms: weeds, waterlogging, erosion, and no grass cover, because in any of these situations, the soil is, of course, not healthy because it is that compacted. And when we have compaction beyond 200 psi, nothing can grow and nothing can live and no water can go through. And so we get these anaerobic soils, very hard soil, and only migrants like weeds can grow. We'll get back to this a little bit later, but I hope that you agree that we are generally in conventional management treating the symptom and not the underlying problem. So we'll get back to this, but let's continue a little bit more and delve a little bit more into these ecosystem processes. Because if the soil is not healthy, like for instance we have the problem like compaction, as you can see here in the figure, there are 4 systems that we need to consider, which is with the first one is the water cycle. As without water there is no life, so getting enough water into your soils is very important. So if we look at the picture, we see on this side, the left side, we see an ineffective water cycle. As you can see here by the arrows, rain is being is not absorbed by the soil, is run off to either the lowest point, so either rivers, lakes, or your dam. At the other side, we can see an effective water cycle. So we have an active soil, and we can see that the water is soaked in. When it falls, it gets soaked in, and it can be either used by the plants, and if it's not used, it will just seepage through to underlying or underground water reservoirs, and that will bring that to rivers or springs, creeks, and that is kind of a slow diffusion of water compared to the one that we have here, which is a quick runoff, and that can be very dangerous, and as we see in the picture, can cause erosion. So we want to keep an active water cycle because we need the water for our organisms and plants, not only for the grass, because there is a symbiosis there that we'll get back to. The next one is we need an effective mineral cycle because it is important to feed our plants. So we have, of course, carbon from the atmosphere that is captured by the plants. Think about the photosynthesis. Think about one of your early on biology classes where trees use the carbon to plus water to make sugars. And those are important for growth and for later on an exchange to get other nutrients. Also nitrogen, also from atmospheric or from, as we can see here, from animals, grazing animals, are important because that feeds, that's the nitrogen cycle, that will also help with feeding the plant and help with growth. And nitrogen is a part to make protein, and that's important. So here again on this side, on the left side, we see an effective mineral cycle, and we see on this side an ineffective water cycle. And as you can see, what happens is that carbon and nitrogen, if if the soil is either compacted, as you can see here, we'll get a runoff of these nutrients and they will end up in our water system. So we'll get a problem with too high nitrogen in our waters. Also, all those nutrients cannot be captured, or they, because there's not a lot of plant material under the ground, we see also a leakage through that. In the end, that will also end up in underground springs. So it is important that if we want to have healthy plants, root systems, and an active soil layer, active soil, that we need to capture those minerals. The third ecosystem process that we need to understand is the community dynamics. With a few exceptions, natural communities strive to develop towards ever greater complexity and thus stability, and that is what is shown here. So if we have here on the x-axis the diversity of species, we can see on this side the low and here the high. And then when we look on the eye, that's where we have the number within the population. So here low and here high. So when we have low diversity, we generally see a high population. And you can probably relate this back to a pest, yes? When there is if there's not stability in the system, generally what we see is that one species is favored, like for instance weeds or pests, animals, so for instance certain insects. But the more we get diversity, the more we get competition within habitat, and the more or the less animals we get, or the less numbers in the population we get. So most of the times in most systems, and if we just put this back to pasture system, we want to have diversity in species of animals or soil workers, and of course in our pasture species, because that will feed our horses. And in our last webinar, in our previous webinar, we really spent some time on pasture species and the importance of variety or biodiversity. So having community dynamics, stability is important, or understanding that, because that will also help you with, well, what are my problems, where do I want to go, and that will help you with which solution you want to adopt to solve the problem. Then the last one, but very important, is the energy flow. So almost all life requires the energy that flows daily from the sun. I think about the basic conversion from solar energy that plants take up, and we already highlighted that in the carbon, in the atmospheric carbon, in the mineral cycle. Because to be able to transfer, energy is never lost. Energy is always transferred from one to the other, so either through water, through organisms. And so when we have animals that feed either on prey animals or on pasture, what we see is they will die, they become part of the soil, and we see this whole circle of life and soil web. But it is very important, because if we look at our pasture systems, if we want to capture more of this energy, we need to have more ground cover, because the plant is one of those organisms that can capture quite a lot of this energy and then transfer that into plant material that can feed your horse. So that's your benefit. So stimulating the energy flow is to have more ground cover. And that needs to be effective. Any questions about that so far? There were two other questions.
Yes.
Shall we have a...
We'll go back to the questions that were asked earlier.
Yeah.
One person has asked, how many horses per acre should you keep? And the other question is, how long can worm eggs last in manure?
Yeah. Okay, so the first one, how many horses how many horses should we have on an acre? Well, from my survey, when I asked horse owners to provide me the number of horses and then also provide me the acreage, so the size of their paddocks or the size of their pastures, we found that there was generally 1 horse per acre. That is the current stocking rate. So sometimes it was a little bit more, 2 per acre. But in general, what we see even, and we'll get back to this, I will show this with some pictures when we get to the pasture planning notes, but it really depends on the condition of your property, how much acreage do you have available for grazing, and sometimes it's good to have more horses in a smaller area, and sometimes it's more preferred to have them in a larger area, depending on what your soil dictates or the health of your soil dictates. So we'll get back to that. So I will get back to that. So there is no standardization, although that is what governments or what welfare organizations try to do, is that a horse needs to have at least one acre per horse. Not necessarily when we look from a ecosystem perspective. Yeah. So I want to get back to that. And then the second question is, how long can eggs live in manure? This again will depend on the water distribution, and so in arid systems they may be encapsulated and they can live for a long time depending on what species it is, but we also know that UV can kill most eggs. And then if there's a lot of moisture, generally we see a quick reproduction process. So in moist conditions we can see a rapid growth. When it's arid, we can see either that it encapsulates and they can still grow, but it takes longer, or if it's very extreme UV and they are exposed quite openly to the UV, we can see that they die off. So that depends indeed on the temperature, so climate and water distribution, and it will also depend on the species of parasites that we're dealing with.
Okay.
Definitely
That's all right, Mariette. You can finish that off, and then perhaps we've got one more question which can lead into this next section.
Yeah, because we're getting now into the regenerative tools that we can use to really improve these ecosystem processes. So if you have any questions on that, maybe we'll do this section first.
Okay.
And we can get back to that.
All right.
Yeah. Do you progress? So in this section, we really I want to get and delve deeper into the tools that we can use to manage the ecosystem. There are many that you are already familiar with. So what I'm going to tell is not necessarily something new, but it's more the way you look at it and maybe some ideas of how to combine them, or when to use them and when not to use them. So generally what we see, or across the globe, but we still rely quite heavily on conventional, or what we call prescription farming. And this is including indeed a cycle of using herbicides to deal with weeds, or fungicides or pesticides to deal, particularly those are used in cropping systems. I think that horse owners are much more aware of the weed, the use of herbicides for killing weeds. Also, the continuously tiling of soils and continuously resowing can put us into this exposing soils and not thinking about how to improve soils, can lead us into this continuous cycle of dependency and what we call prescription farming. So you're like continuously on a medicine, and if you stop taking the medicine, symptoms, will become appear again, weeds will come up again, and you will have to continue tackling it with herbicides, or continuously cropping to get green pick. So, of course, what we see is, like in a horseick paddock, we can also get resistancy. We then see that plants, these weeds, are not responding anymore to these herbicides, and so we get resistancy, and we get even a bigger problem, and that can be very frustrating. And that's also one of the first things that I came across in Australia, is this heavy reliance of prescription farming, and it's also in Europe, where I originally from. But I already got quite early on, I delved more deeper into, well, if we have certain problems and we realize that we created problems with the same, we try to solve the problems with the same mind that created them, we never really step outside that box, so we really need to think about other solutions. So that really brought me onto a journey to find out, well, this sustainability became very popular. But what does it mean? And particular for me was like, how can I apply that into the consulting for horse owners and property design and pasture management, but also within the nutrition? It's a very important aspect. So first of all, when we deal with nature, we deal with complex adaptive systems. And when we look at sustainability, there are many definitions to sustain, to maintain. But what is very important is that if we want to have a sustainable system, we really need to always consider these three aspects. So social, ecological, and economic aspect. It's not only ecological, it's not only what to do best for nature, because we're also dealing with people. We're dealing with you as a horse owners. You may have only a certain budget. And of course that brings us back to the economical part. How much do you want to spend on it? And also socially, for instance, if you make certain decisions on your property, for instance, if we look at compost or manure, where to place your manure, you need to take in consideration aspects of like where the water flows so that you don't have runoff and that you contaminate water. So also from a visual point of view, how does that look towards your neighbor property and things like that. So there are many aspects. So it's not only one decision like doing the right thing for nature. We always have to consider more. And that's where sustainability, what sustainability really means. Of course, for long-term gain, but within that, we have also us and our money and our budget to consider. And then we have to also be really aware that everything changes and that that change isn't the exception of the rule, but the only rule, and that we need to be adaptable. We need to always continuously be willing to make changes. Or if something doesn't work, don't stick to it, maybe do it something else. And I think that's the power of using a number of tools and using a combination of tools. By trial and error, you will find out what works and doesn't work on your property. And I think that's also what most of my consultancy is about. It's not necessarily presenting on a silver plate what you should do, because in each climate, in each circumstances, it may all work out differently. So there is maybe a science to things, but there is a big art factor in pasture management as well, and a little bit of luck sometimes as well, and certain climate conditions that you cannot predict or control unless you pack up and move. And so what I came up with is that, as I said, there is no one solution and there's not necessarily one advice that I give. What I decided is to go on this journey where I combine a number of principles that work with nature rather against nature, that looks at solution, that is for the long term, the intermediate and the long term goals. And so I use a combination of holistic management, permaculture, key-line design, and we will touch on this a little bit in the next session. And then we have behave, which is the grazing behavior of animals. So understanding better how animals graze and how we can utilize to change the landscape. And I've talked about this a little bit in the previous webinar, where I talked about grass species and biodiversity. And of course I integrate that with nutrition. It's all related, because pasture is of course food for horses, so it's an integrated aspect as well, and most of the time we also rely on some supplementary feeding. So it's a whole system, a holistic system, so we need to combine that in that way. So let's talk about tools that we can use. There are, if we look at the bar here below, it highlights the 6 tools that we can use. So the first one is technology, which is the most used tool, and you're probably very familiar with it and you use it probably on a daily basis. The next one is fire, which we call the most ancient tool. So I think most here in Australia are quite aware of using fire to manage systems. But it's an ancient tool, but it can cause some problems if we are overusing them. Particularly also with the technology, if we overuse, for instance, cultivation, we can deplete the soil. We can expose the soil. We are not trapping moisture, and that can cause the death of certain soil workers that are very beneficial to create more biodiversity or stronger plants. And the same thing for fire. If we overuse it, we can deplete the soils. Yes, in the first year it's great. We get the green pick. But if we do it on an every year basis, what we get is that we actually burn all this beautiful organic matter and we're not really bringing anything back. And so we then need to either use composting or mulching ourselves. So again, fire can be a useful tool, but again, overuse it can be harmful. And also, when we're dealing with different climate systems, so when we're in an arid system or in a humid system, they will respond differently. Then rest, which is considered the most misunderstood tool. This may be a bit different from what you may think, is that rest is important for allowing the grasses or the vegetation to recover. So it is indeed an important tool. But why we say it is misunderstood is that if we are overused or if we are in a certain climate, if we're in a certain system, rest can actually cause more problems than benefits. For instance, in a humid environment, rest can be very useful because there's enough moisture in the soil, and so regeneration and decay can happen quite rapidly. But when we're in an arid system, so for instance in South Australia, we have the problem that if we rest it and we don't do any active soil development, so either putting moisture back in the soil or organic matter or microbes, then what we get is oxidation. And you may be quite familiar with it when you drive through these areas. Most of it is kind of oxidated. You see a tree branch or a whole tree laying there, and it's probably you've been driving past it for the last 10 years. It's just probably there because there's no active soil that can break that down. And that is what we call the harmful part of resting, which brings us to living organisms. I think now that everybody's quite convinced that having organisms is very important to break down, for instance, manure. But also it's very important for the transfer of nutrients. They break down the soil, but there is a symbiosis, and we'll get back to this, particularly with fungi and bacteria. They have a symbiotic association with the root system of the different plants, so they exchange nutrients. And so living organisms is the most complex tool, and I think only over the last probably 25 years there's more research has been done to understand these symbiotic relationships, and still till today we don't know always the benefits of certain fungi, certain microbes, or even certain insects, because it's a big world down below the grass. But having worms, having beetles, I think that most people are quite aware that that is very beneficial for the breakdown and making humus, for building soil. Then we have grazing as a tool, and this is generally considered to be the most abusive tool. And I think that everybody is quite agreeing with that when we're talking about symptoms. And I was asking the question, well, weeds, the symptoms being weeds, what is the underlying problem? We got first 4 answers on overgrazing. Indeed, overgrazing can be very harmful for the soil, for land conservation. I want to get back to the concept of overgrazing in my planning notes, so I'll get back to this. But I think that most people will understand that if we are not managing our animals well, that overgrazing can become a problem. And then the last one, which may be new for some, others are quite familiar with this concept, that animal impact can be a very useful tool to manage ecosystem, but it's the least used tool. So it's quite novel within in management of ecosystems. But you're quite aware that we use animals to, of course, manage rangelands. Particular, for instance, in Europe, we have native ponies, and we release even cattle, Scottish Highlanders, to actually manage forest systems, to keep the open landscapes and to keep grasses and certain herbage in these areas. So animals are used for conservation. I think that you're quite familiar with it. But the impact of animals, so clustering a lot of animals together, they have a real positive influence on the soil because they trample it, they, of course, defecate, urinate, even saliva have all very beneficial, have a very beneficial role. Of course, mineral cycle, but also microbes. And that is one tool what they use in holistic management. They call it crash grazing or cell grazing, impact grazing, and that is now becoming more obvious or more of interest, particularly here in Australia, where they actually have big investment companies from Europe and America now investing in Australia to buy up cattle to do this concept to regenerate parts of out west in Australia, and at the same time deliver meat for the industry. So it is a big concept, and it's becoming quite interesting in what they call green investment. But of course, we have these tools, but we cannot use them without, that's why they bracket it, if you look here at that bar again. So these 6 tools, you may be familiar with some, others may be newer, is bracketed by money and labor and human creativity. So for money and labor, one or both of these tools is always required, and I think that if you have no money but you have time, then you can still be able to run a property quite well. Or if you don't have time but you have money, then you let other people do the job. But you need either of them to really make some change on the property. If you don't have money and you don't have time, it's going to be always a struggle. So you need to be very realistic in the goals as well, and how, what best fits in your system, in your lifestyle as well. But of course, we need creativity. So to be able to use this and to be creative, if you don't have money and labor, well, maybe you need to rely much more on creativity. How can you use them all efficiently? Which tools can I use? And that really depends a little bit also on your location and what problems you're encountering. But any of these can be used, and none of these are necessarily bad. So, for instance, fire is not necessarily bad, but if you do it on a continuous basis, that can become a problem. Same thing, grazing can be good, but if you overuse it, it can become a problem. Same with animal impact, same with organisms. If you just build up organisms, you may get this imbalance in diversity. You may get disease happening. So all of these have its pros and cons, but it's about this creativity and being adaptable to which one you want to use. So any questions about these tools? Were there any questions in relation to?
Yes, Mariette, we're nearly out of time.
Solutions or
yes, but we do have 2 questions.
Yeah, we're finishing off.
Yes, one is we have very poor bleached soil and are in a low rainfall area. What is our first step in assisting our soil to improve? We have 200 acres, so it's big to correct, so happy to work on small sections, but I don't know whether to create tree lines throughout with an understory or start with a clover planting. Your suggestions would be appreciated.
Okay, so what was the main problem? That was
bleached soil in a low rainfall area.
Yeah. So we definitely need to think about making your soils more active so that they can hold moisture, that they become have an active role with soil workers to then kind of restore ground cover. I'm not so sure about, for instance, how well the area is covered with plants. But indeed, if it's such a big property, I always say start small. And it's, as I said, a trial and error process. What works in your property and not. And also within that property, there may be certain areas that need a total different approach than other parts. And depending on how it looks, you may need to look into for either soil bathing, either do mulching, composting to hold moisture, or you may have a compaction problem and you may have to decompact. And that's actually the next section. I want to kind of probably continue on this. so that we can finish on time, because I think I'm already running out of that. So I will take this question, and I will go into because we're now heading into resource availability and maintaining healthy soils, so soil development. So if we want to have more resource availability, or we want to take, we want to kind of keep what we have, we need to think about herbivore nutrition and health education. We need to understand their needs, of course. We need to know a little bit about how plants grow and their defense. It's something that we discussed a little bit in our last webinar. And of course, soil and these community dynamics are very important. And that's also one of the issues that this horse owner has, is leakage. So how can I hold the moisture? How can I keep the nutrients? And how can I build or can have healthier soils with maybe stronger plants or more ground cover, or the biodiversity? Depends really on what you're seeking in that area of your property. So one of the first questions I always ask, well, are the weeds growing? Can you easily dig up your soil? So again, based on the patterns and just observing what is happening and not happening. And so what does your soil look like? What color? And here you can see a very clear picture of a healthy soil. Soil needs to be almost kind of black, dark brown, black. Needs to have a lot of soil workers. And on this side we see kind of an oxidated situation. This is all subsoil. All the topsoil has been stripped. And I think that a lot of people are quite confused sometimes about, well, what does my soil have to look like? And any topsoil, no matter, probably if you're in a bit of a sandy area, yeah, you will have a bit of more sand, but still there needs to be an active humus, active topsoil layer with humus and soil work that hold the soil together. It's easy to break down, but it should not crumble. Also understanding that if we have a compaction problem, you will have a hard time to get your shovel in. In particular weeds, if we look at if weeds are growing, that was one of my first questions, knowing that this is the main problem that horse owners are dealing with, we need to see weeds as an indicator. Think about patterns, think about observing, reading the landscape. And so I like this quote, what says, what is a weed? A plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. And this is probably one of the booklets. I got this from a publication, is What Weeds Tell Us. And this person, probably more from a gardening perspective, have really kind of looked at certain plants and what they accumulate or what maybe they indicate. So for instance, certain weeds, such as, well, you can see it as a herb as well. It's not necessarily a bad plant when we talk about weeds, but they generally highlight what is happening or not happening with the soil. So for instance, dandelion shows that it has compaction, the pH is low, it's low in calcium, and it's excessive in potassium. Yes? And you can go through this for many plants. So any indicator plants in your pasture, we have these Patterson curves. You can find a story to it. And so you can probably use this as a tool because organic matter is very important. Because if we use weeds, we can actually accumulate those minerals that are lacking. For instance, if we have a plant that is high in calcium, we can chop that, and that becomes organic matter. And what we need is then a symbiosis with bacteria and with fungi that then deliver those nutrients to your favorable plants, to your grasses. So you need to see this as kind of a succession. So seeing weeds actually as an accumulator of nutrients rather than pulling them out or spraying them, which will affect all these beautiful soil workers. And then also looking at the morphology of certain weeds. So if we look at the thistle, they have deep taproots, and by slashing them, what we're actually doing is letting the plant. Well, the plant is chopped on the top, and what we see is that we get a reaction underground where roots are then also cut off because, well, no more energy, so much energy needs to be put in growth, and also therefore the root system will grow less. And that will break down. And so using weeds and deep taproots would actually allow you to decompact soils because you allow pockets of oxygen, so you allow areas where oxygen can come in and, of course, water. But as you can understand, this is quite a slow process. Yeah? So we need water before we have vegetation to make black soil, to make topsoil. So we need that organic matter to be broken down. So it actually works in two ways. We decompact at the same time we're mulching. But it can be a very slow process, and in certain systems it's just not possible to wait for that. Especially if we are a commercial facility or we've been looking at a pasture for way too long, it's not working, we may need to use one of our technologies. So, for instance, tractors, and in this case we're using a particular system, a deep rip system called with Yeoman's keyline plow. Some may already be familiar with this, and because of time I'm not going to go into much detail about it, and you can read more on it on my website as well. So I will give you, you will get the link to that at the end of the webinar. But what it does, it just kind of speeds up the decompaction process. So by deep ripping, what you're actually doing is slicing the soil, but you keep the topsoil on top. So you kind of close the top part, and so you're not exposing the soil like we see in cultivation. So you really try to hold the moisture in. You allow oxygen and water to kind of get into the deeper layers again. And you do it in just before the rain sets in, and in different in a couple of sessions to decompact your soils. There are many additions that you can do. You can, for instance, here's a better picture. You can at the same time put seeds in it. You can put compost tea or like a fertilizer in there. And there are a couple of, if you would YouTube this, YouTube Super Keyline Plow, you will get very nice videos. I have one here that demonstrates it, but I'm not going to run it just in case we get some technology problems. But this is also on my website, and it really just shows how the plow works and how it slices through the soil. But there are a lot of YouTube movies on this. Mulching is another strategy, so we're using organic matter, so organisms, to help us build soil and to repair the land. So I think that most people are aware of using mulch for eroded areas, so for instance in the corners of your paddock. But of course you have to keep your horses off it. So in most cases when we're doing either keyline plowing or slashing and building soil, we need to take our animals off. And you need to really monitor before you're happy to put your animals on, because if you put so much time or even money in it to make that soil better and you introduce your horses too early, it will be a waste of all that effort and money. And so what it will allow us is to cover the soil, build organic matter, and to trap moisture. We're going to talk about this a little bit more together with composting. So I'm not going to spend now time on composting because we have a whole webinar on this, and that's the next one in early next year. But of course, composting is a very important tool for soil building, and I will tell more about it in the next webinar. Biodiversity, we have already talked about a little bit about sowing and introducing new species into your property, but what I want to say is that if you create the right conditions and you have an active soil, grass species will come back. Think about succession. I spoke about this in the last webinar. You will create the right conditions and these species will grow again. In cases that you want to enhance it or you want to kind of make a change in the species, then you may have to look at sowing. But instead of cultivation, you may want to look at that keyline idea, so kind of what we call non-tiling or non-kill cropping solutions rather than tiling, because if you expose the soil and there's not enough water, you may be oxidizing all this, the soil, as well as all the microbes and organisms will disappear. So I hope now that I'm convinced that healthy soils will help us with creating plants that can feed our horses. But to get those, to get the soil, we need to think about water, and of course thinking about just having organic matter. Don't be picky about which organic matter. Any plant can fill that function to build soil first and then create the right conditions for the right species. Okay, I think that we're quite running out of time. I had a little bit about hydration. which includes dam and swale design and tree planting. I will just kind of go quickly through these. Also with the keyline plow and with combination of the actual design, you can actually use the patterns of deep ripping to move water or actually distribute water through your property. Again, a little bit more information on the website. Also on dam and swale design, I have a couple of articles on how we can use that to hydrate the landscape or to redirect water to kind of or reduce erosion by kind of slowing down the water. So here in the top part of the property, so this is a design that we've done. We see here a swale that is connected to a dam, and what it does is that it just slows down the water. So this is the top of the ridge, and water will of course come down into these lower parts. And to avoid erosion, we have put here a swale to kind of slow down the water and soak it to deeper layers. Dams, of course, to increase water holder capacity. Tree planting is very important, and we have also introduced a gabion system where we can slow down water and reduce erosion. But those are all little things that you can add to your techniques. It's not only just thinking about pasture. It's a lot of other elements that you need to set in place if you want to create the right conditions. I think everybody is quite aware that trees play a very important role in hydrating the landscape, the world. And so investing some time in tree planting is very important, because one of my passions is actually to, I'm not going to go through it, I think everybody's quite aware what kind of function trees play in the ecosystem. And but one of my passions is that we can actually, in particular in systems where, for instance, in droughts or in flood systems, we may have to be resourceful and actually use trees to feed our horses. And even if you have enough pasture, having variety and offering horses more choice is very rewarding to see how they behave and show their foraging behavior. And as you can see, they just totally relish it. Even though they have enough pasture, they like this, something different. Here are a couple of species. Again, I have some information on my website about native and introduced species that you could plant. Again, be very careful. In certain regions, they may not like my selection, okay, because this is based a little bit on permaculture, where we use native and introduced species that can repair certain or have a multiple functions and that can repair the landscape. But for instance, willows are not always allowed in certain areas, or they don't really like them in water areas, water courses and things like that. And bamboo may sometimes be a problem if we look at the running types. But there are a lot of trees that we can that are safe and that as a supplement, not sole food, can be fed to horses. And then I want to finish off. I think I'm going quite rapid, but I want to finish off on the note of pasture planning, because actually this is an invite for a whole webinar. But I just want to probably finish with that question of overgrazing. So what is overgrazing? Because there was a question about, well, how many horses should I have, or how many horses can go on an acre? So I want you to look at this picture where we have a lot of animals in one place. So would you call this overgrazing? And if we go now to another scenario, generally what we see in horses, where we see probably the same condition, but we see only a few animals. Actually, the animals is kept individually. So would you say that it's the number of animals that causes the problem? Because most people are of opinion that it's the amount of animals. That's why the question was there for how many animals should I have in an area. Well, actually, research has shown that overgrazing is not related to the number of animals in a paddock, but it's rather affected by the time the animals spend in the paddock. So it's the exposure to the plant that will dictate if something will be overgrazed or not. And I hope that that's a bit clear. And so it's not always clear-cut to say, well, in 1 acre you can have so many horses. It really depends on how much biomass is available and how much other paddocks do you have available to move animals in there to allow for recovery. And that's what this impact grazing is doing, is putting a lot. That was the picture, that first picture of those cattle, is just putting a lot of animals in one area for a short period of time and then move them along. And that is not considered overgrazing. That is just exposing the plant for a short time to heavy grazing, and then you move the animals out of it. Whether in pasture system with horses, we generally see a stock grazing situation. And so it's important that we plan our grazing, and I want to finish off with that there are a number of strategies that either you may already use, well, some will be familiar with the rotational system. But what we're really aiming to do is that we want to allow pastures to recover. And so we need to monitor our grasses if we want to get a better recovery, if we want to estimate our recovery period. And we do that by moving animals out and allowing the grass to grow. But if we overgraze it, as you can see here on the top, it will take a longer time to recover. As you can see, the plant is having a hard time still at day 15 if we compare it to plant B, which we only grazed for a short time, but quickly, where it still has a little bit of leaf area, and it will recover much quicker because it has a little bit more root system and a little bit more leaves to capture the sun's energy. And then we use different methods to establish that, and I think this is the invitation where if we want to reduce pasture problems, and we've used all the tools that we can to manage our systems, our ecosystems, and our pastures, then the next step is really very critically look at how you plan your moves of your horses to the paddock. Most of the horse owners are in a set stock situation. Some say they are doing rotational grazing, but having a better understanding what the differences are of smaller paddock grazing, or if you like the idea of larger paddocks, how can you do that in the best way, and how can you best combine it also with sacrifice areas or central point systems in those cases where you may not have enough subdivisions. So, rushed through that slightly, but I hope still that it was very useful to continue on those the topic of soil development, hydration, and a little bit on pasture planning notes. So, more than happy to take final questions or leave the questions, and we'll make a we'll answer them maybe in an email. I will leave it up to Julie.
Yes.
What do you want to do?
Thank you very much, Mariette. I think any outstanding questions that people have got we'll answer by email, because we have gone quite a bit over time, but thank you very much, Mariette. Certainly a lot of information in there.
Yeah. And if you want to update yourself on as I said, some of the information, I didn't have enough time. Please visit the website or follow us on Facebook to get some more information about or background information about any of these subjects.
And I think too the next slide, Mariette, might have a link to your next two webinars. So if you have any friends that you think might be interested, if you could just point them towards this. And we have recorded or are recording this webinar, so we'll send an email to everybody with the link when that's online. So thank you very much again, everybody, for attending. Thank you to the Adelaide and Mount Lofty Ranges NRM for sponsoring this event, and of course to Mariette for all her work putting it together and presenting. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.